Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest. I'm so glad you're here with me today for another tale of betrayal, obsession, and aristocratic revenge. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing our community span across continents. Tonight's story takes us deep into the heart of 1840s England, where a father's greed becomes his greatest mistake. A young woman sold like cattle for £200. A duke who spent $500,000 searching for the girl who vanished into the night. And a reckoning that will shake the very foundations of high society when these two souls finally collide. They thought she was worthless. They thought he'd forgotten. But what no one understood was that the Duke of Pemberton never forgot a face, never forgave a betrayal, and never stopped searching for the one woman who haunted every waking moment of his carefully controlled existence. What happens when a man with unlimited power finally finds what was stolen from him? Let me take you back to that bitter March evening in 1843, where the rain fell like judgment upon a crumbling estate, and where one girl's life was sold for the price of a decent horse, unknowing that the buyer had already pledged his entire fortune to bring her home. The drawing room of Hartley Manor smelled of dampness and desperation. Rosalind Hartley stood perfectly still beside the dying fire, her hands folded before her worn gray dress, her eyes fixed on the watermarked wallpaper that had once been cream but now bore the yellowish tinge of neglect. She had learned long ago that stillness was safety, that invisibility was survival. Her father, Gerald Hartley, paced before the hearth with the manic energy of a man whose creditors had finally cornered him. His once fine coat hung loose on his diminished frame, the buttons tarnished, the velvet worn smooth at the elbows. He had been handsome once, her mother had told her before the fever took her. Now he was merely hollow, a shell of a gentleman whose gambling debts had consumed everything the family had ever possessed. £200, he muttered, more to himself than to his daughter. £200 for a girl who eats more than she's worth. It's generous, really. More than generous. Rosalind did not reply. She had learned that lesson too. Silence prevented escalation. Silence meant he might forget she was there, might turn his attention to the brandy instead, might collapse into his chair and leave her in whatever peace the night might offer. But tonight, he seemed energized by whatever devil's bargain he had struck. The Duke of Pemberton's man came himself, Gerald continued, stopping to warm his hands at the meager flames. Traveled all the way from London. Said the Duke required a girl of good breeding for his household. Said he'd pay £200 for the right candidate. £200, Rosalind. Do you know what that means? She knew exactly what it meant. It meant she was being sold. Like the silver that had already left the house. Like the paintings that had disappeared from the walls. Like the horses that had been led away one by one until even her mother's gentle mare was gone. It means I can pay Lewiston, her father said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. It means I can settle with Barrows. It means I can sit at the tables again with my head held high. £200, and all I have to do is send you to London. To a duke's household, Rosalind? You should be grateful. A girl like you, plain, no dowry, no prospects. You should be on your knees thanking me for securing you such a position. Plain. The word settled over her like the familiar weight of an old shawl. She had heard it so many times, it no longer even stung. At 22, she had long since accepted that she would never be beautiful. Her features were too strong, her frame too tall, her complexion too pale. Her hair, a muddy shade between brown and auburn, refused to curl fashionably no matter how her mother's old maid had tried. Her eyes, a clear gray, were too direct, too intelligent. Men did not like women who looked at them as though they could see straight through to the rot beneath. "When do I leave?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Gerald turned to her, surprised that she had spoken. "Tomorrow. The coach comes at dawn. His man left instructions. You're to bring nothing but what you can carry. Everything else will be provided. Fine dresses," he said. "Proper clothing for a duke's household." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks against the grate. "What will I be doing?" Rosalind asked. "In this household?" Her father waved a dismissive hand. "Companion to some elderly relative, I assume. Reading, needlework, whatever it is you women do. Does it matter? You'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly, which is more than I can provide here." It was the closest he had ever come to admitting his failures. Rosalind felt something twist in her chest. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of hollow recognition. This was what their lives had become. This was what his weakness and her mother's early death had wrought. "I'll be ready at dawn," she said quietly. Gerald had already turned back to the fire, already calculating, no doubt, which gaming hell he would visit first. "See that you are. And Rosalind, try not to embarrass me. The Duke of Pemberton is one of the most powerful men in England. If you can manage not to displease him, there might be references, opportunities." She doubted her father cared about her opportunities, but she nodded anyway. Then she turned and left the drawing room, her worn boots silent on the threadbare carpet of the hallway. Her room, when she reached it, was as cold as the rest of the house. The small fire that should have been burning in the grate had been allowed to die. Another economy, another small cruelty of their reduced circumstances. Rosalind wrapped her mother's old shawl around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the narrow bed that had been hers since childhood. £200. The sum echoed in her mind. It seemed both enormous and insultingly small, enough to temporarily satisfy her father's debts, not nearly enough to reflect a human life. But what was her life worth, really? She had no skills beyond the basic accomplishments of a gentleman's daughter: passable needlework, adequate French, a decent hand at the pianoforte, though the instrument had been sold 2 years past. She could read and write, keep household accounts, manage servants, though there were none left to manage. She knew how to move through society, how to make polite conversation, how to become invisible when required. Perhaps that was what the Duke of Pemberton wanted: an invisible woman. Someone to attend his elderly aunt or invalid mother. Someone to read aloud from improving books and pour tea and keep her eyes downcast. She could do that. She had been training for invisibility her entire life. Rosalind stood and moved to the small trunk at the foot of her bed. It took less than an hour to pack everything she owned. 3 dresses, all of them shabby but clean. Undergarments that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was barely visible beneath the careful stitches. Her mother's shawl, her mother's prayer book, its leather cover worn soft with use, a small sewing kit, the silver hairbrush that had somehow escaped her father's creditors, hidden in the back of her wardrobe. When she was finished, the trunk was barely half full. She lay down fully clothed on the bed, pulling the thin coverlet up to her chin. Outside, the March rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, and somewhere in the house below, she could hear her father moving about, muttering to himself, already lost in whatever fantasies £200 could buy. Rosalind closed her eyes and tried not to think about what morning would bring, tried not to wonder what kind of household she was entering, tried not to feel the creeping dread that had been building in her chest since her father had first spoken the Duke's name. The Duke of Pemberton. She knew the name, of course. Everyone did. He was spoken of in the kind of hushed tones reserved for men of enormous power and uncertain temperament. Wealthy beyond measure, connected to half the great families in England, a man who moved in circles so elevated that people like Rosalind and her father existed only as distant, irrelevant specks. What would such a man want with a girl like her? The question followed her down into uneasy sleep, where it twisted itself into dreams of grand houses and cold marble floors and a pair of eyes, dark, unreadable, that watched her from shadows she could not escape. The coach that arrived at dawn was far finer than anything Rosalind had expected. Black lacquered wood gleamed despite the early morning drizzle, and the 4 horses that pulled it were beautifully matched grays that stamped and tossed their heads with barely restrained energy. The driver, a stern-faced man of middle years, barely glanced at her as he loaded her small trunk into the boot. Gerald had not risen to see her off. She had not expected him to. The interior of the coach was even more luxurious than the exterior. Soft leather seats, velvet cushions, a lap blanket of impossibly fine wool. Rosalind settled herself in the corner and pulled the blanket over her knees, her hands folded tightly in her lap. As the coach lurched into motion, she took one last look at Hartley Manor through the rain-streaked window. The house looked exactly as it was, a slowly collapsing monument to her family's decline. She felt nothing looking at it. No sadness, no nostalgia, only a hollow sense of relief that she would not have to watch it crumble any further. The journey to London took 2 days. They stopped at coaching inns where Rosalind was given private rooms and meals that seemed absurdly lavish after years of near poverty. The driver never spoke to her beyond the barest necessities, and Rosalind did not attempt conversation. She ate mechanically, slept fitfully, and spent the traveling hours watching the countryside roll past and trying to imagine what awaited her. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, they entered London. Rosalind had been to the city only once before, when she was a child, and her family still had money. She remembered it as overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the impossible press of humanity. Now, watching from the coach window as they navigated streets that grew progressively more elegant, she felt that same sense of being utterly out of her depth. The buildings here were grand, beyond anything in the countryside. White stone facades rose 4 and 5 stories high, their windows gleaming, their doorways flanked by servants in elaborate livery. This was Mayfair, she realized. This was where England's wealthiest and most powerful made their homes. The coach finally stopped before a house that made all the others look almost modest in comparison. It was a massive structure of pale stone, with a columned entrance and windows that seemed to go on forever. Even the street it occupied seemed quieter, more exclusive, as though only the truly elite were permitted to breathe this particular air. The driver opened the door, and Rosalind stepped down on trembling legs. Before she could take more than a few steps toward the entrance, the great door swung open, and a tall, impeccably dressed butler emerged. "Miss Hartley," he said, his tone perfectly neutral. "Welcome to Pemberton House. I am Graves. If you will follow me, please." Rosalind followed him into an entrance hall that took her breath away. Black and white marble stretched in every direction. A massive chandelier dripped crystal above her head. The ceiling was painted with classical scenes she could barely make sense of in her shock. And the staircase. God, the staircase was a work of art in itself, sweeping upward in a graceful curve, its banister gleaming with polish. "The Duke is in his study," Graves said, leading her across the hall. "He wishes to see you immediately." Immediately. Not even time to collect herself, to prepare. Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs as they moved down a long corridor hung with portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women. Finally, Graves stopped before a heavy oak door and knocked twice. "Enter." The voice from within was deep, cultured, and absolutely devoid of warmth. Graves opened the door and gestured for Rosalind to step through. She did, her legs moving through pure force of will. The study was dark despite the daylight outside. Heavy curtains were half drawn, and only a few lamps burned against the gloom. Behind a massive desk sat a man who made every assumption Rosalind had formed utterly irrelevant. He was not old. He could not have been more than 35, though there was something about him that seemed ancient, a weariness in his eyes that spoke of too much knowledge, too much power, wielded for too long. His hair was dark, almost black, worn slightly longer than fashion dictated. His features were aristocratic to the point of severity. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that truly arrested her. Dark brown, almost black in the dim light. They fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though every secret she had ever harbored was suddenly visible. "Miss Hartley," he said, rising from his chair. He was tall, powerfully built beneath his perfectly tailored coat. Every movement was controlled, economical, as though he never wasted a single gesture. "Please sit." Rosalind sat in the chair he indicated. Her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her, and she kept her own gaze lowered, focused on the grain of wood in his desk. "Look at me." The command was quiet, but absolute. Rosalind raised her eyes to his and felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said, 7 years. Rosalind blinked. "Your Grace?" 7 years, he repeated, his voice still soft, but threaded through with something she couldn't identify. 7 years I have been searching for you, Rosalind Hartley. 7 years, and 200 pounds is what your father valued you at. Her breath caught. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't." He moved around the desk with the grace of a predator, stopping just a few feet from her chair. "You don't remember me at all, do you?" Rosalind's mind raced. Remember him? How could she possibly? And then, like a door opening in a dark room, a memory surfaced. A summer garden party. She had been 15, her mother still alive, her family still solvent. And there had been a young man, not yet titled, who had asked her to dance, who had spoken to her about books and music and made her laugh for the first time in months, who had looked at her like she was something precious rather than plain. "Lord Cassian," she whispered. Something flickered in his eyes. "You do remember. Your father was still alive. You weren't yet the Duke." He finished her sentence. "No, I was merely the heir. Powerless in all the ways that mattered." He turned away from her, moving to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "We spoke for 3 hours that day. You told me about your mother's illness, about the books you loved, about how you wished you could travel beyond England's shores. You made me laugh, Rosalind. Do you have any idea how rare that was? How rare it remains?" She couldn't speak. The memory was flooding back now. How kind he had been, how interested in her thoughts. How, when the party had ended, he had asked if he might call on her. How her father had said yes, distracted, and already calculating what connection to the heir of a dukedom might be worth. "I came to call on you," Cassian said, still not looking at her. 3 days later. "Your father informed me that you were indisposed. I came again the following week." Indisposed again. "The 3rd time I came, your father told me that you had left to stay with relatives in Scotland, that you would be gone for some time." "I never went to Scotland," Rosalind said faintly. I was there, in the house. He told me." Her voice broke. "He told me you had come once and decided I wasn't suitable, that you wouldn't be returning." Cassian's shoulders tensed. Of course he did. He turned back to face her, and the fury in his eyes stole her breath. Not directed at her. She understood that instinctively. Directed at the man who had sold her, who had lied to them both. "Your father came to me privately, told me that, while you had enjoyed my company, you were too young for serious courtship. That if I truly cared for your welfare, I would wait. Give you time to mature. I was 24 years old, Rosalind." Stupidly honorable. So I waited. For how long? The question emerged as a whisper. 2 years. I waited 2 years, during which time my father died, and I assumed the title. And when I finally returned to claim what I had been promised, you were gone. Your entire family had vanished in the night. The house sold to pay debts. No forwarding direction. Nothing. Rosalind felt the world tilting beneath her. My father said we had to leave quickly, that there were debts. We went north to my mother's family estate. But she died within the year, and after that, she stopped, unable to articulate the slow descent that had followed. The isolation, the poverty, the gradual understanding that no one was coming to save her. "I have spent 7 years and £500,000 searching for you," Cassian said, each word precisely articulated. "I have employed investigators across 3 countries. I have tracked every Hartley in England. I have pursued rumors and whispers and dead ends. And do you know what finally led me to you?" She shook her head mutely. Desperation. The word was bitter. Your father's desperation. He made inquiries in London, quiet inquiries, to men who broker certain transactions, girls for wealthy households. My network caught wind of it, and when they brought me his name, when they told me he had a daughter of appropriate age, his hands clenched at his sides. I sent my man with instructions to offer him £200. Do you know why such a specific sum? No. Because I wanted to know exactly how little you were worth to him. I wanted the number I would carve into his flesh when I finally made him pay for what he stole from me. The violence in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, Rosalind felt something else entirely. A strange, fierce satisfaction that someone, anyone, had thought her worth searching for. Worth £500,000. Worth 7 years of relentless pursuit. "You're not here to be a companion to some elderly relative," Cassian continued, his voice dropping to something quieter but no less intense. "You're here because you belong to me, Rosalind. You have belonged to me since that day in the garden, when you laughed at my terrible joke about Milton and looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. Your father stole you. He sold you. But I have bought you back. And now," he moved closer. Close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "Now, I am going to make him understand exactly what he lost." "How?" Her voice barely functioned. A smile curved his mouth, cold, predatory, full of dark promise. "You are going to marry me, Rosalind Hartley. You are going to become the Duchess of Pemberton. And when your father learns that the girl he sold for £200 is now one of the most powerful women in England, when he learns that the fortune he might have secured through an honorable alliance is forever beyond his reach, when he sees you dripping in jewels he could never afford, and standing beside a man whose influence could crush him like an insect, that is when he will understand what his greed cost him. That is when he will feel a fraction of what I have felt every day for 7 years. Rosalind's mind reeled. Marriage, Duchess, revenge. The concepts tumbled over each other, too enormous to process. "You cannot possibly. I am no one. I have no dowry, no connections. I would ruin you socially." "I am the Duke of Pemberton," Cassian interrupted, his voice like iron. "I do not care about society's opinions. I care about reclaiming what was stolen. I care about making the man who dared to separate us understand the magnitude of his mistake. And I care." His voice softened fractionally, and he reached out to touch her face with a gentleness that contrasted shockingly with the fury that had come before. "I care about the girl who made me believe, for 3 hours 7 years ago, that I might find something in this world beyond duty and expectation. I care about making sure she never disappears again." His fingers were warm against her cheek. Rosalind's eyes burned with tears. She refused to let fall. "This is madness." "Yes," he agreed. "It is. But I have been mad for 7 years, Rosalind. This, at least, is a madness with purpose." His thumb brushed against her cheekbone. "Marry me. Let me give you everything your father's weakness denied you. Let me show you the life you should have had. And let me destroy the man who thought you were worth no more than 200 pounds. She should refuse. She should be horrified. She should recognize this for what it was: obsession, possession, a revenge plot that would entangle her in schemes she couldn't begin to understand. But when she looked into Cassian's eyes and saw the same hollow ache she had carried for years reflected back at her, when she felt the ghost of what might have been if her father had been honest, if she had been allowed to choose. "Yes," Rosalind heard herself say. "Yes, I will marry you." The smile that transformed Cassian's face was terrible and beautiful. He pulled her to her feet, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes burning into hers. "Then let the reckoning begin." Outside, the London rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. While inside Pemberton House, two souls stolen from each other 7 years ago began plotting the sweetest revenge England's high society had ever witnessed. The transformation began immediately. Cassian led Rosalind from his study to a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor that took her breath away. The bedchamber alone was larger than the entire ground floor of Hartley Manor had been. Cream silk draped the walls. A massive bed dominated the space, its carved posts reaching nearly to the ceiling, its coverlet a waterfall of embroidered ivory. Windows overlooked a private garden where early spring flowers were just beginning to emerge despite the rain. "These will be your rooms until the wedding," Cassian said, watching her take in the space with obvious overwhelm. "After, you will move to the Duchess's suite adjoining mine." Rosalind turned to him slowly. "How long until the wedding?" 3 weeks. Her eyes widened. 3 weeks? That's impossible. The banns alone. "I have already obtained a special license," Cassian said calmly. "We can be married whenever we choose. I chose 3 weeks because you will need that time to be properly prepared." He moved to pull a sash beside the mantel, and within moments, a middle-aged woman in severe black entered the room. "Mrs. Winters, this is Miss Hartley. She is to become my wife. I want her wardrobe completely replaced within the fortnight. Spare no expense. She is to have everything a duchess requires." Mrs. Winters's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of her surprise, before she dropped into a curtsy. "Of course, Your Grace. Miss Hartley, if you will permit me to take your measurements." Rosalind found herself nodding, still reeling from the speed at which her life was being reorganized. Cassian moved toward the door, then paused. "I know this is overwhelming," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in his study. "But you are safe here, Rosalind. I need you to understand that. Whatever else I am, I will never harm you. I will never allow anyone else to harm you. You have my word." Then he was gone, and Rosalind was left alone with Mrs. Winters, who proved to be briskly efficient and far kinder than her severe appearance suggested. Arms up, miss, if you please, Mrs. Winters said, producing a measuring tape from her apron. My, but you're tall for a woman. That's good. You'll carry the grand styles well. The Duke has excellent taste, though I'll admit he's never shown much interest in ladies' fashions before. You must be very special indeed. Rosalind stood obediently as the woman measured and noted measurements in a small book. I don't understand any of this, she confessed quietly. Yesterday, I was being sold for £200. Today, I'm being told I'll be a duchess. Mrs. Winters paused in her measuring and fixed Rosalind with a surprisingly sympathetic look. The Duke is not a man who does anything by halves, miss. If he's decided you're to be his duchess, then that's what you'll be, and heaven help anyone who tries to stand in his way. She resumed measuring. I've been in this household for 15 years. I've seen his grace through his father's death, through taking up the title, through every social game and political machination London can throw at a young duke. And I have never, not once, seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you when he brought you through that door. How did he look at me? The question emerged before Rosalind could stop it. Mrs. Winters smiled, a small, knowing thing. Like a man who has finally found something he thought lost forever. Like a man who would burn the world down before he let it slip away again. The word sent a shiver through Rosalind that was equal parts fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Rosalind's head spinning. Modistes arrived at all hours, bringing fabrics and colors and textures she had never imagined. Silks that whispered against her skin. Velvets so soft they felt like sin. Laces delicate as spider webs. She was fitted for morning dresses and afternoon dresses and evening gowns. For riding habits she would never use. For traveling costumes and opera cloaks, and a trousseau that seemed designed for a woman who would live a dozen lifetimes in high society. And through it all, Cassian was a constant presence, not hovering, but there. He took breakfast with her each morning in the small dining room, asking about her preferences, her needs, her comfort. He walked with her in the garden when the weather permitted, telling her about the estate in Northumberland that would be her summer home, about his seat in Parliament, about the responsibilities that came with being a duchess. He never touched her beyond the occasional brush of hands or the formal offering of his arm, never pressed for more than she seemed ready to give. But the intensity never left his eyes when he looked at her, and Rosalind found herself hyper-aware of his presence in every room they shared. One evening, 10 days before the wedding, she found him in the library, a massive room lined floor to ceiling with books that made her heart ache with longing. He was seated in a leather chair by the fire, reading, and he looked up when she entered. I wondered when you would find this room, he said, setting aside his book. Mrs. Winters said you'd been asking about it. I didn't mean to intrude, Rosalind said quickly. Intrude? Cassian stood, gesturing to the shelves around them. This is your home now, Rosalind. Every room in it is yours to use as you please, especially this one. He moved to one of the shelves and ran his hand along the spines. I remember you telling me that you loved reading, that if you could do nothing but read for the rest of your life, you would die happy. She had said that. In the garden 7 years ago, when she had still been young enough to speak her dreams aloud without fear of mockery. I've tried to remember everything you told me that day, Cassian continued quietly. Every small detail, every preference. And I've spent 7 years building a life that I hoped, if I ever found you again, might make you happy. He turned to face her. This library has over 10,000 volumes. I've acquired first editions of every author you mentioned. Loving. poetry, philosophy, novels that society matrons would blush to have in their drawing rooms. It's all here, Rosalind, waiting for you. The gesture undid something in her chest. She moved forward without thinking, her hand reaching out to touch the nearest shelf with reverent fingers. You did this for me? Even not knowing if you would find me? I did it because the alternative was madness, Cassian said. Because if I couldn't have you, I could at least build you a temple and hope that somehow, someday, the gods would be merciful enough to bring you back to it. Rosalind turned to him. This man who had become the center of her rapidly transforming world. I don't understand you, she whispered. We spent 3 hours together 7 years ago. How can you possibly feel this way? He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away, close enough that she could smell the bergamot of his cologne, could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. I have asked myself that question every day for 7 years. I have no rational answer. I only know that from the moment you laughed at my terrible joke and looked at me like I was someone real rather than a title and a fortune, something in me recognized something in you, and I have never been able to let it go. His hand rose slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished. When she didn't, he cupped her face with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. You think I'm mad? You're probably right. But I have been mad for so long that sanity holds no appeal. So let me be mad, Rosalind. Let me dress you in silks, and give you libraries, and make your father choke on his regret. Let me have this one thing I have wanted for 7 years. Please. The please broke her. This powerful, controlled man, begging her for something she was already too far gone to deny him. Rosalind reached up and covered his hand with her own, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. I'm frightened, she admitted. Good, Cassian said softly. Fear means you understand the stakes. But I promise you, Rosalind, I will never give you cause to regret this. I will spend every day for the rest of our lives proving that you were worth 7 years. Worth £500,000. Worth everything I have and everything I am. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that Rosalind felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of this man. He was not simply obsessed. He was not simply possessive. He was desperate in the way of someone who had lost something precious, and by sheer force of will had dragged it back from the void. And she, plain, unwanted Rosalind Hartley, she was the thing he had fought 7 years to reclaim. When he pulled back, his thumb stroked along her jaw once before he stepped away, giving her space to breathe. The wedding is in 10 days, he said, his voice rough. After that, the real work begins. After that, we make your father understand exactly what he destroyed when he chose 200 pounds over you. How? Rosalind asked. How do we make him understand? Cassian's smile was sharp as a blade. We invite him to witness his daughter's triumph. We bring him to London. We make him watch as you are presented to society as my Duchess. We force him to stand in ballrooms where every influential person in England defers to you, where you wear jewels worth more than he will see in his lifetime, where you move through a world he sold away for the price of a decent horse. His eyes glittered. And then, when he is drowning in the magnitude of what he lost, then I will lean in close and tell him exactly how much I paid to find you, how much I would have paid, how he could have been the father-in-law to a duke, but instead will die knowing he bartered away a fortune for 200 pounds and his own stupidity. It was cruel. It was calculated. It was perfect. When do we send for him? Rosalind asked, and was startled by the steel in her own voice. Cassian's expression shifted into something like pride. After the wedding. After you are legally protected by my name and my power. After there is nothing he can do to touch you ever again." He moved back to his chair, picking up the book he had set aside. "Now, sit with me. Read something. Let me grow accustomed to having you here, in this room that I built for you." Rosalind selected a volume of Byron, scandalous, her father would have said, inappropriate for unmarried women, and settled into the chair opposite Cassian's. The fire crackled between them. Rain pattered against the windows, and for the first time in 7 years, Rosalind Hartley felt something almost like peace. The wedding took place on a gray April morning in the private chapel at Pemberton House. Rosalind wore a gown of ivory silk that fit her like water, its train a river of Belgian lace that trailed 6 feet behind her. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, heirlooms, Cassian had told her, that had belonged to his mother. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that she barely recognized, threaded with pearls and small white roses. When she saw herself in the mirror before descending to the chapel, she did not recognize the woman looking back. This was not plain Rosalind Hartley. This was someone transformed. Someone who looked like she might actually belong beside a duke. The ceremony itself was brief, only a handful of witnesses, Mrs. Winters, Graves, a few of Cassian's closest associates, no family on either side. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Cassian kissed her with a possession that sent heat flooding through her entire body. His hands cupped her face, his mouth claiming hers, with an intensity that promised everything and demanded nothing she was not willing to give. When he pulled back, his eyes burned into hers. "Mine," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Finally mine." "Yours," Rosalind agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. The breakfast that followed was elegant, but subdued. Cassian seemed to sense that she was overwhelmed, that the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. He kept his hand over hers throughout the meal, his thumb tracing small circles on her wrist, a constant grounding presence. It was only later, when they had withdrawn to their private sitting room, that he brought up the next phase of his plan. "Tomorrow," he said, pouring them each a glass of wine, "I will send a letter to your father. It will be brief. It will inform him that his daughter has married the Duke of Pemberton. It will invite him to London for a small gathering in 2 weeks' time, where he will have the pleasure of seeing you formally introduced to select members of society." Rosalind accepted the wine with trembling hands. "He'll come." "Oh, yes," Cassian said with dark certainty. "He'll come. He'll come because he'll believe this is his chance to finally profit from the connection he tried to prevent. He'll come thinking he can manipulate his way into my good graces, perhaps secure some financial assistance. He has no idea that he is walking into his own public execution. And when he arrives, what then?" Cassian settled beside her on the sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Then you will be everything he told you that you could never be. You will be gracious, elegant, powerful. You will move through that gathering like you were born to this role. And I will ensure that every influential person in that room understands that you are mine, that I value you beyond measure, and that your father is nothing more than the fool who nearly destroyed both our futures." Rosalind sipped her wine, tasting the sweetness and the sharp edge beneath. "I want him to suffer," she said quietly, surprised by the viciousness in her own voice. "I want him to understand what he did, not just to me, to you, to both of us." "He will," Cassian promised. His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. "I have waited 7 years for this. I will not waste the opportunity." They sat in silence for a while, the fire burning low, the evening settling around them. Finally, Cassian spoke again, his voice softer than before. I know this happened quickly. I know I've given you little choice in how our lives have unfolded. But I want you to know. He paused, seeming to search for words. I want you to know that while revenge is what drove me to find you, it is not what will sustain this marriage. I meant what I said in the library. I will spend every day proving that you were worth the search, that you are worth everything. Rosalind turned to look at him, this complicated man who had upended her entire existence. I believe you, she said simply. And she did. Whatever else Cassian was, obsessed, possessive, dangerously focused, he was also sincere in his devotion to her. She could feel it in every carefully chosen book in the library, in every gown that had been commissioned to her exact preferences, in the way he looked at her like she was something rare and precious that might disappear if he looked away. Good, Cassian said, and kissed her temple. Now, my Duchess, tell me, how do you want to destroy your father? Because while I have planned the broad strokes, the details should be yours to choose. And so, as the fire died to embers, and the London night pressed against the windows, the Duke and Duchess of Pemberton began plotting their revenge, with the careful precision of two people who had lost years to someone else's greed, and would not rest until that debt was paid in full. The letter arrived at Hartley Manor on a Tuesday morning. Gerald Hartley received it from the post, with hands that trembled slightly from the previous night's drinking. When he saw the seal, the Pemberton crest impressed into black wax, those trembling hands went still. He broke the seal with nervous fingers and read, Mr. Hartley, I write to inform you that your daughter, Miss Rosalind Hartley, was married to me on the 7th of April, 1843. She is now Her Grace, the Duchess of Pemberton. You are cordially invited to attend a gathering at Pemberton House on the evening of the 23rd of April, where the Duchess will be formally introduced to select members of London society. Your presence is expected. Yours, Pemberton. Gerald read the letter 3 times, certain he was hallucinating. Married? To the Duke of Pemberton? The girl he had sold for £200 was now a duchess. His mind raced with possibilities. This changed everything. Everything. The connection he had tried to prevent 7 years ago when that young lordling had come sniffing around his daughter. It had happened anyway. And now, instead of being shut out, he had an invitation directly from the Duke himself. This was his chance, his redemption. The Duke clearly wanted to establish family ties, wanted to bring Rosalind's father into the fold. There would be opportunities here, financial support, social connections, perhaps even a position, something with a salary that would allow him to live properly again. Gerald immediately began composing his response, accepting the invitation with effusive gratitude. He did not stop to wonder why the Duke had purchased his daughter for £200 only to marry her. Did not question the coldness of the letter's tone, did not consider that he might be walking into anything other than the salvation he so desperately needed. He was a fool. But then, Cassian had counted on that. The 2 weeks between the wedding and the gathering passed in intensive preparation. Cassian hired a woman whose sole purpose was to tutor Rosalind in the intricacies of aristocratic society. How to move, how to speak, which topics were acceptable and which were forbidden. How to manage a household of 50 servants, how to host dinners where every piece of silverware carried significance. How to navigate the treacherous waters of London's elite without making a single misstep. Rosalind absorbed it all with the same fierce determination that had helped her survive years of her father's neglect. She would not embarrass Cassian. She would not give society any reason to dismiss her as unworthy of her position, and she would not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The night before the gathering, Cassian found her in the library, surrounded by etiquette manuals and looking slightly panicked. "Enough," he said firmly, taking the book from her hands. "You could study for 10 years and never master every nuance of this absurd dance. But that's not what tomorrow night is about." "Then what is it about?" Rosalind asked, frustrated. "It's about you standing beside me, wearing the Pemberton diamonds, and making every person in that room understand that you belong there. Not because you've memorized which fork to use, but because I have chosen you. Because my regard makes you untouchable." He pulled her to her feet, his hands on her shoulders. "Do you trust me?" "Yes." "Then trust this. You could commit a dozen social errors tomorrow night, and it would not matter. Because I will not allow anyone to question you. I will not allow anyone to make you feel less than you are. You are my Duchess, Rosalind. That is the only credential you need." She leaned into him, letting his certainty bolster her own fragile confidence. "What if I disappoint you?" "Impossible," Cassian said against her hair. "You could never disappoint me. You exist. That alone exceeds every expectation I've ever had." The gathering was held in Pemberton House's grand ballroom, a space that could easily accommodate 200, but which Cassian had deliberately limited to 50 guests. The most influential 50 people in London, hand-selected for their social power and their ability to spread word of what they witnessed. Rosalind descended the stairs on Cassian's arm, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that made her gray eyes look silver. The Pemberton diamonds circled her throat, dripped from her ears, banded her wrists. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that would have taken her maid 2 hours to achieve. She looked, Cassian had told her with fierce satisfaction, like a duchess. The guests were already assembled, champagne in hand, conversation humming through the space. When Cassian and Rosalind appeared at the top of the stairs, that conversation died. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cassian's voice rang out with absolute authority, "may I present my wife, Her Grace, the Duchess of Pemberton." The response was immediate, a wave of curtsies and bows, murmured greetings, the rustle of silk as people positioned themselves for the best view. Rosalind kept her spine straight, her expression serene, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. They descended together, and immediately people began approaching. Lords and ladies, whose names Rosalind had only read about in scandal sheets. Politicians whose decisions shaped England's future. Social arbiters whose approval could make or break a reputation. And Cassian, true to his word, made certain that every single one of them understood that Rosalind was not to be questioned. He introduced her with pride. He kept his hand at the small of her back, a constant claiming. When one particularly acid-tongued countess made a veiled comment about Rosalind's family, Cassian's response was ice. "The Duchess's family is now my family," he said with lethal quietness, "and I would suggest, Lady Ashworth, that you consider very carefully whether you wish to insult a duke's wife in his own home." Lady Ashworth paled and immediately offered profuse apologies. The message spread through the room like wildfire. The Duke of Pemberton would tolerate no disrespect toward his Duchess. Anyone who dared would find themselves on the receiving end of his considerable displeasure. It was, Rosalind realized, a masterful performance. Cassian was using his power to build her a fortress, brick by careful brick. By the end of the night, no one would dare question her right to stand beside him. And then, an hour into the gathering, Graves appeared at Cassian's elbow. "Your Grace," he murmured. "Mr. Boutre, Gerald Hartley has arrived." Cassian's hand tightened fractionally on Rosalind's back. "Show him in." Rosalind's breath caught. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. Gerald Hartley entered the ballroom looking exactly as she remembered. Shabby coat, thinning hair, the desperate eagerness of a man who thought he was about to be saved. He saw Rosalind immediately, and his face transformed into an obsequious smile. "Rosalind!" He moved toward her with open arms. "My dear girl, I received the Duke's letter. I can hardly believe. A duchess! My daughter? A duchess!" Rosalind stood perfectly still, not returning his embrace. Cassian stepped forward smoothly, inserting himself between father and daughter. "Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "How generous of you to attend. Your Grace." Gerald dropped into an awkward bow. "I cannot express my gratitude for this invitation. To know that my dear Rosalind has found such happiness, such elevated circumstances." "Your dear Rosalind," Cassian interrupted, "whom you sold to my agent for £200. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Gerald's smile froze. "Your Grace, I don't... That was simply a household position, I thought." "You thought you were selling your daughter like cattle," Cassian said, each word precise as a surgeon's knife. "You thought £200 was sufficient compensation for a human life, for your own child." Gerald's face flushed. "I was desperate. The debts were caused by your gambling and your weakness," Cassian cut him off. "Do not dare to justify what you did. Do not dare to stand in my home and claim desperation drove you to auction your daughter to the highest bidder." The guests were riveted, scandal and horror warring on their faces. This was not the polite gathering they had expected. This was something else entirely. "But Your Grace," Gerald stammered, "surely you understand. I had no choice." "You had every choice," Cassian said, his voice dropping to something quiet and infinitely more dangerous. 7 years ago, I came to your home asking permission to court your daughter. I was honorable. I was respectful. I was the heir to a dukedom, and I wanted Rosalind with a desperation that should have been obvious to anyone with eyes. Do you know what you told me, Mr. Hartley?" Gerald's face had gone white. I don't recall. You told me to wait, that she was too young. That if I truly cared for her welfare, I would give her time." Cassian's hands clenched at his sides. "And like a fool, I believed you. I waited, and while I waited, you disappeared. You took her away where I could not find her. You let her believe I had rejected her. You let me believe she was lost forever. And you did all of this because you wanted to keep your options open. Wanted to see if you could extract a better offer from someone with more immediate wealth to spare. That's not... I would never..." Gerald's protests died under the weight of Cassian's fury. "I have spent 7 years searching for your daughter," Cassian continued, his voice rising now, filling the ballroom. "I have spent £500,000 tracking every lead, pursuing every rumor, turning over every stone in 3 countries looking for the girl you stole from me. £500,000, Mr. Hartley. And do you know what finally led me to her?" Gerald couldn't speak, could only shake his head numbly. "You," Cassian said with vicious satisfaction. "You and your pathetic attempts to sell her again. When my agents told me that a Gerald Hartley in the North was quietly offering his daughter to wealthy households, I knew. I sent my man with instructions to offer you exactly £200. Do you know why?" "No," Gerald whispered. "Because I wanted to know exactly how little she was worth to you. I wanted the number that would brand you for the rest of your miserable life. £200, Mr. Hartley. That's what you valued your daughter at. That's what you accepted in exchange for the woman who is now one of the most powerful duchesses in England." Cassian turned to Rosalind, extending his hand. She took it, moving to stand beside him, facing her father with all the cold fury she had suppressed for years. "Look at her," Cassian commanded Gerald. "Look at what you sold. Look at the fortune you bartered away for the price of a mediocre horse. Every jewel she wears is worth more than you will earn in your lifetime. Every dress in her wardrobe costs more than your annual income. She moves in circles you will never access. She wields influence you will never possess. And all of it, could have been yours through an honorable alliance. But you were too greedy, too short-sighted, too contemptuous of your own daughter to see what was standing in front of you. Gerald's eyes filled with tears. Whether of shame or self-pity, Rosalind neither knew nor cared. "Rosalind," he said brokenly, "please, you must understand." "I understand perfectly," Rosalind said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I understand that you saw me as a burden to be sold rather than a daughter to be cherished. I understand that you lied to both of us, manipulated both of us, because you thought you could profit more from my misery than from my happiness. I understand that given the choice between my welfare and £200, you chose the money without hesitation." "I'm your father," Gerald tried weakly. "No," Rosalind said. "A father protects, a father cherishes, a father would sooner die than sell his child. You are simply the man who sired me, and who made every possible wrong choice thereafter." She stepped closer, letting him see the diamonds at her throat, the silk of her gown, the absolute certainty in her eyes. "I am the Duchess of Pemberton now. I am married to a man who spent 7 years and £500,000 searching for me, who built me a library of 10,000 books because I once told him I loved reading, who will destroy anyone who dares to harm me or question my worth. That is what real devotion looks like, Father. That is what you could have aligned yourself with if you had possessed even a fraction of the honor you pretended." Gerald's face crumpled. Around them, the guests watched with rapt attention, this social execution more riveting than any play. Cassian's arm came around Rosalind's waist, pulling her back against his side. "You will leave London tonight," he told Gerald. "You will return to whatever hovel you currently occupy, and you will live out the remainder of your days knowing that you held a fortune in your hands and threw it away for £200. That the daughter you dismissed as plain and worthless is now sought after by every social climber in England. That you will die alone and unmissed while she lives in splendor with a man who would burn the world down before he let her go." "Please," Gerald whispered, "surely some small assistance." "You will receive exactly what you gave me 7 years ago when you stole Rosalind away," Cassian said flatly. "Nothing. Not a penny. Not a reference. Not a single moment of my time or attention. You are nothing to me, Mr. Hartley. You are nothing to your daughter. You are simply the cautionary tale we will tell when people ask how we met. The greedy fool who sold a duchess for £200. He nodded to Graves, who materialized with several footmen. "Show Mr. Hartley out. Ensure he finds his way to the nearest coaching inn. His business here is concluded." Gerald tried one more time to reach for Rosalind, but the footman blocked his path. He was escorted from the ballroom like the beggar he had become, his protests fading as he was removed from Pemberton House forever. When the doors closed behind him, the assembled guests erupted into furious whispered conversation. Cassian ignored them all, turning to Rosalind with eyes that searched her face carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Rosalind said, and meant it. She felt lighter than she had in years, as though some crushing weight had finally been lifted. "Yes, I am perfectly all right." Cassian's thumb stroked along her jaw. "That was magnificent. You were magnificent." "We were magnificent," Rosalind corrected, and stood on her toes to kiss him in front of the entire assembly, a claiming as deliberate as his had been at their wedding. When she pulled back, the guests were staring with a mixture of shock and fascination. Cassian smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and utterly transformed from the cold fury he had directed at Gerald. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I believe we have given you quite enough scandal for one evening. Please, enjoy the champagne and reflect on what you have witnessed. And when you tell this story, and I know you will all tell this story, remember this: the Duke of Pemberton found what was stolen from him, and anyone who tries to take it again will face consequences that make tonight look like mercy." It was a warning and a promise wrapped in velvet and steel. The guests understood. Word would spread through London by morning. Rosalind was untouchable, protected, beloved beyond measure by a man whose power was matched only by his obsessive devotion. For the rest of the evening, they circulated through the gathering, accepting congratulations and fielding carefully oblique questions about the scene they had witnessed. Cassian never left Rosalind's side, his hand always at her back or holding hers, a constant physical reminder that she was his and he was hers, and nothing would ever separate them again. When the last guest had finally departed and they were alone in the quiet ballroom, Rosalind turned to Cassian with exhaustion and exhilaration warring in her expression. "Is it truly over?" "The revenge?" Cassian pulled her close, his arms coming around her. "Yes. Your father will live out his days in exactly the misery he deserves, knowing what he lost. But our life together—" He kissed her forehead, her temple, the corner of her mouth. "That is only beginning, my Duchess." "I love you," Rosalind said, the words emerging with startling clarity. "I don't know when it happened. Perhaps that day in the garden 7 years ago. Perhaps during these past weeks, watching you build me a life out of obsession and devotion. But I love you, Cassian, completely." His arms tightened around her until she could barely breathe. "I have loved you since the moment you laughed at my terrible joke and looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. I have loved you through 7 years of searching, and I will love you through every day that follows, until they put me in the ground, and perhaps even after that." They stood together in the empty ballroom, two people who had been stolen from each other, and who had fought their way back through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Outside, London slept, unaware that in Pemberton House, a duke and his duchess were beginning a love story that had been 7 years in the making. A love story that had cost £500,000, countless hours of searching, and the systematic destruction of the man who had dared to interfere with fate. A love story that was worth every penny, every moment, every ounce of obsessive devotion that had gone into reclaiming what should have been theirs from the start. And as Cassian led Rosalind from the ballroom toward their private chambers, where the rest of their lives waited to unfold, he made her one final promise. "I will never stop choosing you, Rosalind. Every day for the rest of my life, I will wake up and choose you. Again and again and again." "Then I will do the same," Rosalind said, and kissed him with all the passion of a woman who had been overlooked her entire life, and who had finally, impossibly, found someone who saw her as precious beyond measure. In the morning, London would wake to the scandal of the Duke of Pemberton's gathering. Society would gossip for months about the father who sold his daughter for £200 and the Duke who spent £500,000 finding her again. The story would become legend, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. But none of that mattered to the two people at the center of the tale. They had what they wanted. They had each other. And they had the rest of their lives to build something beautiful out of the ashes of what had been stolen. 7 years of searching. £500,000 spent. One perfect revenge executed to perfection. And one love story that proved some things, some people, are worth any price, any weight, any obsessive devotion required to bring them home. The end.